The street looked quiet, almost too quiet. Rows of neat houses stood side by side, their lawns trimmed, their fences painted, their driveways spotless. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect neighborhood. Families waved politely, children rode their bikes, and dogs barked happily in the distance. To anyone passing through, this was a dream community. But beneath the calm smile of the neighborhood, there was a shadow with a name: Karen. Karen was the president of the HOA, and everyone knew her, not because they liked her, but because they feared her. She had eyes everywhere, or at least it felt that way. If a trash can was left on the curb for a few minutes too long, a letter would arrive in the mailbox the very next day. If a flower pot didn't match the approved HOA color scheme, a fine would show up before anyone could even blink. And Karen didn't stop at letters and fines. She yelled at kids for playing outside too loudly. She stormed across yards to lecture families about their mailboxes, and she even once scolded a man for parking slightly crooked in his own driveway. To her, every small thing was a crime, and she was the judge, jury, and executioner. Neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors. They complained in hushed voices at backyard barbecues or late at night over the phone, but no one dared to stand up to her. Karen had ruled the HOA for years, and she used those rules like weapons. If someone pushed back, she would push harder, burying them in threats and fines until they gave up. It seemed like Karen was untouchable, like she could keep her grip on the community forever. But what no one knew, not yet, was that her reign was about to crack. Because one day, Karen went after the wrong family. At first, it seemed like the same old story. A new family moved into the neighborhood, full of excitement about their fresh start, their dream home, and the peaceful street they thought they'd found. But instead of a warm welcome, they were met with Karen's cold stare. From day one, she was on them. A warning about their mailbox, a complaint about their lawn, notices piling up before they'd even unpacked their last moving box. The neighbors saw it happening. They pitied the family, but none of them spoke up. They had all seen this before. Karen choosing a target, breaking them down, and moving on to the next. But this time, something felt different. This family didn't look scared. They didn't look ready to bend under Karen's rules. In fact, they looked like they were waiting, watching, quietly measuring their opponent. And as the days went by, Karen grew bolder, piling on threats and fines with a smirk of victory. She didn't know it, but with every notice she sent, with every harsh word she barked, she was digging her own grave. Because this family wasn't like the others. They were ready to fight. And what they would uncover about Karen, what they would bring to light, would shake the entire neighborhood. The calm street, the neat lawns, the quiet houses. They were all about to witness a storm like no other. And by the end of it, Karen from the HOA would get exactly what she deserved. Karen liked to think of herself as the protector of the neighborhood. She walked the streets with a clipboard in her hand and a permanent frown on her face, scanning each house like a guard on duty. To her, no detail was too small to control. If a trash can sat on the curb 5 minutes past the collection truck, Karen noticed. The next day, a letter would arrive in the homeowner's mailbox, sharp and cold. Violation. Fine due immediately. If a fence had even the smallest chip in its paint, Karen demanded the entire thing be repainted. It didn't matter if it was new or if the weather had simply worn it down. Karen wanted perfection, and her word was law. And during the holidays, when families tried to bring joy to their homes, Karen brought nothing but anger. She banned certain lights, certain lawn decorations, even wreaths that she claimed were not in line with community standards. If a child begged to put up a glowing reindeer or a spooky Halloween skeleton, the parents had to say no or risk one of Karen's heavy fines. The rules were supposed to keep the neighborhood beautiful. That's what Karen always said. But beauty came at a cost. Behind every perfect lawn and spotless driveway was a family living in fear. Neighbors learned to whisper when Karen walked by. They avoided eye contact. They moved their cars quickly. They hid their decorations in garages. They followed the rules not out of respect, but out of fear. Karen had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom. She used the rulebook as a weapon, waving it at anyone who dared to question her. She knew that most families didn't have the money or energy to fight back. A single fine might seem small, but when she stacked them one after another, they added up fast. Many families just gave in, paying her fees and doing what she demanded. To outsiders, the neighborhood looked perfect. The lawns were trimmed, the houses neat, the streets quiet. It looked like a postcard image of the American dream. But if someone looked closer, if they stepped inside one of those perfect homes, they would hear the truth. Parents warning children not to leave toys in the yard, couples arguing over letters from the HOA, families grumbling late at night about Karen's endless demands. The anger was there, bubbling beneath the surface. Everyone felt it, everyone knew it, but no one dared to act. Because Karen had been in power for years, and in that time, she had broken down every attempt at resistance. Or so she thought. Because just beyond her watchful eyes, a change was coming, and the perfect kingdom she built out of fear was about to face its first real crack. The house at the end of the street had been empty for months. Neighbors often glanced at it, wondering who might move in next. One warm Saturday morning, moving trucks finally rolled in. A young couple stepped out, their children running around with excitement. They looked happy, hopeful even. For them, this was a fresh start, a dream come true. Boxes piled on the driveway, laughter filled the air, and neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. Some wanted to go over and say hello. But then they saw Karen standing across the street, arms crossed, watching every move. Her stare alone was enough to keep them inside. By the end of the first week, the family's dream started to crack. The first notice arrived tucked neatly inside their mailbox. Violation. Grass exceeds length limit. Immediate action required. The couple looked at their lawn in confusion. The grass was barely taller than anyone else's, but Karen had decided it was too long. The next notice came 2 days later. Mailbox not HOA approved. Must be replaced within 7 days or face fines. The family frowned at the mailbox. It was sturdy, clean, and brand new. But apparently it wasn't on Karen's list of acceptable designs. Then came the one that made their children cry. Driveway cluttered with toys and bicycles must be cleared immediately. Their kids had only left 2 bikes by the garage, but Karen had spotted them and written her warning with a cold pen. The parents felt the message loud and clear. They weren't welcome here. Each notice stung worse than the last. Instead of enjoying their new home, the family began to live under a cloud of fear. They rushed to cut the lawn before Karen drove by. They moved the mailbox they loved. They told their kids to put their bikes away every second of the day. It wasn't the life they imagined. They had bought a house, but it didn't feel like home. And while the neighbors watched quietly. They saw the notes piling up. They saw the kids looking sad. They saw the parents growing frustrated. Whispers passed between them. Karen's at it again. But no one spoke out. No one dared to help. Because they all knew what would happen if they did. Karen would turn her eyes on them, and they would become her next target. So, the family was left alone, standing in the middle of a perfect-looking street that suddenly felt like a prison. Karen, meanwhile, felt powerful. She told herself she was protecting the community, keeping it clean and organized. But the truth was darker. She enjoyed it. She enjoyed the control, the way people bent to her will, the way they feared her clipboard more than anything else. And with every notice she sent to the new family, her smirk grew wider. She thought she was winning. She thought she was breaking them down, just like all the others. But she didn't know the truth. This family was not like the rest. And the storm that was coming would make her regret every single letter she had ever written. For weeks, the new family tried to keep peace. They followed every rule, no matter how unfair. They trimmed the lawn twice a week, repainted their mailbox, and made sure their driveway was spotless. But it wasn't enough for Karen. It never was. One afternoon, the parents decided to start a small garden in their backyard. Nothing fancy, just a patch of flowers and a few vegetables. Their children helped, laughing as they planted seeds in the soft dirt. It was the first time in weeks they felt a little bit of joy in their new home. But when Karen saw it, everything changed. A week later, a thick envelope arrived. Inside was a notice that made their jaws drop. Karen had fined them thousands of dollars for their garden. She called it unauthorized landscaping and claimed it was against HOA guidelines. The family was stunned. A simple garden, something harmless, something beautiful, turned into a crime in Karen's eyes. The children cried when they heard their parents whispering late that night. The father clenched his fists. The mother's voice shook with frustration. They had worked hard to buy this home, and now it felt like Karen was trying to take it away from them. For a moment, they felt hopeless. It was the same trap that caught so many others before them. Most families would have given in, paid the fines, torn up the garden, and stayed silent. But this family was different. They weren't afraid of Karen. The father stared at the letter, his jaw set. "This isn't right," he said. The mother nodded. "If she wants to fight, then we'll fight back." Instead of giving up, they started to dig, not in the garden, but in the HOA's rulebook. Night after night, they sat at their kitchen table, flipping through thick pages filled with legal words. They highlighted sections, circled loopholes, and made notes in the margins. The more they read, the more they realized something strange. Karen had been bending the rules for years. Many of her fines weren't supported by the actual HOA guidelines. She had twisted small details, stretched vague sentences, and used fear to make people obey. That alone was shocking. But the family didn't stop there. They began asking quiet questions, searching through old meeting notes, and talking carefully with neighbors who dared to whisper. What they found was worse than they imagined. Karen wasn't just misusing the rules, she was misusing the money. HOA funds that should have gone to community projects, repairs, or neighborhood events were disappearing. Expenses were listed for things no one remembered approving. Fancy dinners, landscaping work done only at Karen's house, even charges that looked like personal vacations. Piece by piece, the truth came together like a puzzle. Karen wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was using it. The family exchanged glances across the table one late night. Their fear had turned into determination. They weren't just fighting for their garden anymore. They were fighting for every neighbor who had been silenced. And as their pile of evidence grew, so did the suspense. Because what they discovered wouldn't just shock Karen. It would shock the entire neighborhood. The family didn't stop once they saw the first signs of corruption. They dug deeper. Every night, their dining table became a battlefield covered in papers, meeting notes, and bank statements they had managed to get hold of. At first, the numbers looked confusing, but slowly the pattern became clear. Karen had been treating the HOA's money like her own personal wallet. There were charges for fancy dinners at expensive restaurants, yet no record of any community event connected to them. There were bills for landscaping, but the only yard that had ever received such care was Karen's. And then came the most shocking discovery: travel expenses, plane tickets, hotel stays, even vacation packages, all tucked neatly into the HOA's budget as administrative costs. The more they uncovered, the angrier they grew. Families had been fined for a child's bicycle or a flower pot, while Karen had been using their money to live in luxury. But anger wasn't enough. They needed a plan. The parents decided to move carefully. They couldn't storm into an HOA meeting and shout about corruption without proof. Karen would deny everything, twist the words, and crush them the way she had crushed others before. No, this time the evidence had to be airtight. So they worked in silence. They copied documents, made notes, and built a case strong enough to expose Karen for who she really was. Once they were sure, they chose their first allies, the neighbors who had quietly complained for years, but never had the strength to stand up. The father knocked on doors late in the evening, papers tucked under his arm. At first, people were hesitant to even speak, but when they saw the records, real, undeniable proof, their eyes widened. Karen wasn't just strict. She wasn't just power-hungry. She was a thief. For the first time, the neighbors felt something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. One by one, he joined the family's side. Whispered conversations spread from driveway to driveway, from porch to porch. It was still dangerous. If Karen found out too soon, she would retaliate. But the spark had been lit, and it was growing stronger. The perfect neighborhood, the place that always looked polished and calm, was no longer quiet on the inside. Because now, for the first time, Karen's control had a weakness. And the people she had silenced for years were beginning to realize they might finally have the power to take her down. The whispers spread quickly. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now spoke in low, firm voices across fences and porches. The evidence moved from hand to hand, and every time someone read it, their fear turned into anger. They all saw the truth. They had been victims all along. The warnings, the fines, the shame. None of it was about protecting the community. It was about Karen's control. And while families scraped to pay her demands, she had been dining in luxury, upgrading her yard, and vacationing with their money. The discovery gave them something they hadn't felt in years: hope. One evening, several families gathered at the new neighbor's home. Papers covered the table, voices buzzed with nervous excitement. Finally, someone said what they were all thinking. We have to confront her at the HOA meeting. The room went silent. The thought of standing up to Karen in public made hearts race. But then another neighbor nodded. If we all go, she can't silence us. And so, the plan was born. For days, the neighborhood waited. Karen walked the streets as usual, clipboard in hand, handing out warnings with her usual smugness. She thought nothing had changed. But behind every door she passed, families were preparing. Parents whispered after dinner, children listened wide-eyed, and old neighbors who had given up years ago felt their courage return. The streets still looked perfect and calm, but inside each house burned a quiet fire. Karen had no idea. To her, the meeting would be like every other, another night where she ruled from her chair at the head of the table. She couldn't imagine that her power, built on years of fear, was about to crumble. The neighbors knew it. The family who started it all knew it. And as the day drew closer, the air grew heavy with suspense. Because soon, for the first time, Karen would face a united neighborhood. And this time, she wouldn't be the one in control. The night of the HOA meeting arrived. The community hall buzzed with low voices as families filled the seats. Some clutched papers, others sat stiff with nervous energy. Everyone knew this night would be different. At the front of the room sat Karen, clipboard in hand, her chin lifted high. She tapped her pen against the table as if daring anyone to challenge her. To her, this was just another night of control, another chance to remind the neighborhood who held the power. The meeting began as usual. Karen barked out the rules, scolded small violations, and flipped through her notes with her usual smugness. The neighbors sat silent, their eyes fixed, waiting for the moment. Then it happened. The new family slowly rose from their chairs. The room grew still. Karen's eyes narrowed, ready to shut them down. But before she could speak, the father's voice rang out, calm, steady, and clear. "We have proof," he said, holding up a folder. "Proof that Karen has been using HOA funds for herself." The words cut through the air like a knife. Gasps rippled through the room. All eyes turned to the folder. Karen's confident smile faltered for the first time. The family stepped forward, placing documents on the table. One by one, they read them aloud. Expensive dinners labeled as meetings, landscaping bills that matched Karen's own yard, vacation costs hidden under administration. The room erupted in shocked whispers. People leaned forward, eyes wide, anger and disbelief spreading like fire. Karen slammed her pen on the table. "Lies!" she shouted, her voice sharp. "All lies! These people don't know what they're talking about!" But the papers were undeniable, and before she could gather her strength, another neighbor stood up. "I remember when my fence had to be replaced," the man said. "I paid fines for months while Karen's yard was being redone with HOA money." Then another voice joined in, and another. Soon, neighbors all over the room were speaking, sharing their stories, their anger, their years of silence. Karen tried to shout over them, her voice rising higher and sharper, but the tide had turned. For the first time, her threats carried no weight. The crowd was louder, stronger, and united. She pounded the table, her face red with fury. "You're all against me. I am the president of this HOA. You can't do this." But deep down, even she could feel it. Her power was slipping. The neighbors stood together, their voices echoing through the hall. And Karen, once the untouchable ruler of the neighborhood, now found herself surrounded, outnumbered, cornered. The meeting that was supposed to be hers had turned into something else entirely. It was her reckoning. The room was alive with voices, the air thick with tension. For the first time, Karen was not the one in control. Her shouts no longer silenced the crowd. Her threats no longer scared anyone. The neighbors had found their courage, and there was no going back. One of the board members, usually silent under Karen's rule, slowly stood up. His voice trembled at first, but it grew stronger as he spoke. "It's time for a vote. Tonight we decide if Karen should remain HOA president." The words hung in the air. Karen froze, her face pale. She opened her mouth to argue, but the neighbors were already raising their hands. One after another, hands went up, fast, firm, and without hesitation. Yes, yes, yes. The room filled with a chorus of agreement. Nearly every hand was raised. Karen looked around in disbelief, her eyes darting wildly as if searching for a single ally. But there were none. The final count was clear. Karen was removed. Effective immediately. The once powerful woman sat back in her chair, stunned. Her voice cracked as she tried to protest, but the board read the decision aloud. She was also required to repay the money she had taken. The dinners, the landscaping, the vacations, every dollar had to be returned. Karen's reign was over. The neighbors, who had lived in fear for so long, could almost feel the weight lift from their shoulders. A hush fell over the room, followed by a wave of cheers and clapping. Some smiled through tears, others hugged one another. Outside, children who had been waiting quietly with their parents ran to the playground, their laughter echoing in the night. It felt as though the whole neighborhood could finally breathe. Fences no longer looked like symbols of punishment. Mailboxes no longer felt like traps. For the first time in years, the community felt like home again. In the days that followed, the change was clear. Famtard. Eileys decorated their yards with lights and flowers without fear of fines. Kids left their bikes on the driveway without secret worry. Neighbors waved to each other with relief, no longer divided by Karen's rules. And in every corner of the neighborhood, People whispered the same words with a mix of pride and disbelief. She's gone. Karen from the HOA had built her kingdom on fear, but in the end, it all crumbled when the people stood together. The community that once felt broken was whole again, and while Karen would never be forgotten, she would always be remembered for one thing. In the end, Karen from the HOA got exactly what she deserved.